it was our role as the National Trade Association to stand up and bring all the voices of the hotel industry together under one banner, and that is the No Room for Trafficking campaign. So on this slide, just the main pillars of the campaign are to bring that collective voice of the industry into the public conversation, but also to the conversation with legislators and regulators and those who have a role also in creating the laws that govern this type of activity through enforcement, but also through prevention. So we have worked with them, we continue to work with them, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But the basic pillars, as I referenced, are to raise awareness through various efforts that we've done publicly and through partnerships. We're working with our members to review and assess updates and protocols and procedures on how to continue to improve our efforts to stop human trafficking in the context of the hotel industry. That is also done through education, ongoing education, as well as support through partnerships. That is through law enforcement groups, but also nonprofits that advocate for victims. We have many great partnerships with those organizations, which I'll get into momentarily. On the next slide, I get a little bit further into some of the elements of our campaign and some of what we are advocating for when we talk publicly and when we talk to legislators about what the hotel industry believes should be done to eradicate human trafficking, particularly with respect to the hotel industry. That includes all of these elements, but I'll just kind of tick through them. Training staff on what to look for and how to respond, displaying signage on for what hotel employees can do if they suspect a situation. Establishing a company-wide policy, I'll mention that briefly as we go along, but that's essentially making sure that we as an industry, as an association, we are also practicing what we're preaching, so that we're not just training our employees, but we're also holding our employees accountable should they be engaged in this type of activity. Ongoing coordination with the law enforcement, I think that speaks for itself. An open line of communication so that law enforcement understands the lengths that our industry is going to stop this activity is very important. And then sharing those success stories so that we know what we're doing, we can kind of measure the metric that it's working. So those are the key elements. On the next slide is an example of one of the public things we're doing, and I'll just hope that the technology works to play this, and then I'll talk on the other side.
Human trafficking is one of the fastest growing crimes in America. Traffickers often use legitimate businesses to carry out their heinous crimes. America's hotels are tackling this issue every day, training every hotel worker to combat trafficking, increasing our cooperation with law enforcement, partnering with national trafficking prevention organizations. We're taking a unified industry approach to save lives, leading the way in the travel industry. Learn more about our commitment.
So I think you understand an idea of just one element of what we're doing to illustrate what the hotel industry is doing, but also you saw the website there at the end, ahla.com/human trafficking or No Room for Trafficking. They both redirect to the same place. That's all of our resources for hotels, for associates, and for the general public and the media to understand what we're doing to combat this. Just to give you an example of the content of the training that we promote, and I should say that AHLA doesn't have any preferred training provider. We as an association don't actually provide the training. There are several hospitality industry foundations and educational institutes and third-party groups like ECPAT and the BEST organization and Polaris that have content that generally follows the same form, and that the reason for that is because much of it is set in state law in several states. So there are common themes of what the content is. But one key thing is defining terms. And so just to give you an example of the content, within the context of human trafficking, there are two components: sex trafficking and then labor trafficking, which I'll discuss in a second. Sex trafficking, as it says here, commercial sex exploitation through forced sex worker prostitution, forced pornography, and child sexual exploitation material, sex tourism, non-commercial sexual slavery, and or combinations of the above. I should point out that I don't believe it's listed here, but one important definition is that a minor under the age of 18 engaged in prostitution is legally automatically categorized as being a victim of sex trafficking, of human trafficking. So that I think is an important element when we talk about things that may have historical stigmas. So that's part of the content of the training that's provided to associates that we hope is a universal training. On the next slide, labor trafficking, the other half, if you will, of human trafficking, all work or service which is exacted from any person under the threat of penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. In the US, this is common in work in homes as domestic servants or farm workers coerced through violence as they harvest crops, and then to some extent in restaurants, cleaning services, construction, and factories. So human trafficking being the overarching type of activity, but within that is sex trafficking and labor trafficking. On the next slide, to give you some more ideas of the content of the training that AHLA promotes to our members and to their associates, some signs to look for, and these were developed this list was developed by the Blue Campaign of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So just to name a couple, excessive requests, or excuse me, requests for room or housekeeping services, but denies hotel staff to enter room. The presence of multiple computers, cell phones, pagers, credit card swipers, or other technology. Extended stays with few or no personal possessions. And then obviously excessive amounts of sex paraphernalia in rooms such as condoms, lubricants, or lotions. A few on the next slide so that was within the room when we're talking to other associates within a hotel, such as concierge, bellman, front desk, security, and valet. Some signs that they can look for. The same person reserves multiple rooms. The room is rented hourly, less than a day, or for long-term stays that does not appear normal. Individuals selling items to or begging from patrons or staff. Car parking lot regularly parked backwards so the license plate is not visible. Just a few things to look for. And I should, what I'm going through here is certainly by no means the comprehensive training program. A typical training for an associate for all of the awareness training and how to report that takes a minimum of 35 to 40 minutes if it's done in a physical location. Some states and some brands allow that it can be done through an app or a web-based program, but still all of those take the better part of an hour. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a glimpse of the type of training that hotel associates go through, where it's mandated by state law, or more commonly where the state association or the brand recommends it or requires it as a brand standard. On the next slide, just to give you an idea, this is staggering. I perhaps should have opened with this, but human trafficking, $150 billion industry, which is just really a staggering statistic. I think that speaks to why we can never do enough to stop this. It's not just a hotel issue. It takes place in other venues, but we have to do our part. I should say that we are also, AHLA also works with other groups, industry groups and companies that can have a role in stopping this type of activity, such as the airlines, the trucking industry, and restaurants. 1 in 4 victims are children. Also very, very staggering and unfortunate. And then I think, unfortunately, the second to the last one, that such a small percentage are actually rescued. So we hope that through our efforts, we can turn those numbers around dramatically. On the next slide, I think the PSA that I showed spoke a little to this, but this just really proves that the training works. As part of that campaign, the No Room for Trafficking campaign, AHLA is actually asking that governments mandate training onto the industry. That's pretty rare for a business group to go to elected officials and regulators and say, we would like a new mandate. But we think that's what's going to be required, so that every single hotel associate and employee is trained to identify and report potential situations of human trafficking. The vast majority are already doing that, either because they're in states where it is required or because it's a brand standard. But we all know that there are bad actors and bad apples in the industry, and so we want to do what we can to ensure that those are rooted out. And I think that's going to be through training. On the next slide, just speaking to kind of what we think our role is, or we know our role is. Many of these, and unfortunately, the perpetrators of these types of crimes, the traffickers, see hotels as an anonymous place where they can do this type of business. We want to make it as inhospitable as possible, and that's kind of, I know that's contrary to our industry, but for traffickers, we don't want the business. We don't want to profit from it. We don't want to appear to profit from it. There is, unfortunately, a really it's not widespread, but you'd be surprised probably that there are elected officials and folks in law enforcement who think that there may actually be hotels who see this type of activity as a revenue center. I can't imagine that, and if those people are in our industry, then we need to root them out, as I said, and they need to be brought to justice. So we're doing our part to make, as I said, hotels a very inhospitable location for trafficking, so that we can work towards a larger solution with other partners. On the next slide, just speaking a little bit to the company-wide policy. Apologies for the small text on that screenshot, but this essentially speaks to not only training your employees to make it part of their job duties, but also as employees. We hold our employees to certain codes of conduct, whether it be attire, depending on the specific job function, or attendance, or all kinds of things. So why shouldn't we have very, very strict policies for engaging in this type of activity? So I think this speaks to practicing what you preach as a company. Every company should do that for internal reasons, in addition to being the eyes and ears to stop this type of activity among guests. On the next slide, we spoke a little bit about this. Traffickers often rely on legitimate businesses, unfortunately, in tourism, and hoteliers are uniquely positioned to lead the effort to stop this. We're going to do that, and we're making great strides. I'll get a little bit into some of the specific events that we're doing in that regard. Raising awareness, again, an important aspect, so that in addition to the day-to-day training, but also a public story. We need to ensure that there's a public narrative that hotels are not a good place to go for this type of activity, and so we can root it out in our industry and in others. And that is, of course, takes place through coordination with law enforcement and training. Now I want to get into some of the specific events that we've done and external work as part of the No Room for Trafficking campaign. As I mentioned, we launched it in June of 2019, and there was a great deal of press attention to what the industry was doing, and we were glad for that. But this is not there's no horizon line on this work that we're doing. There's no end of this quote unquote campaign. So we want to continue to keep the momentum up, ensure that our partners in law enforcement and nonprofit advocacy groups and the general public know that we are continuing to work towards a solution. So as part of that, what we've been doing is a series of regional events around the country. So the launch of this campaign was in Washington, D.C. last June. But since then, we've had events from around the country with different combinations of local leaders. So the one here was from an event that we did in January in Miami Beach in the lead up to Miami hosting the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, big events like Super Bowls and sporting events do create a spike in incidences of human trafficking. And so we partnered with the NFL and local groups like the Women's Fund and the State Attorney General of Florida and several local mayors to come together and talk about what we're doing, the tactics that we're implementing to raise awareness and to stop human trafficking. And the most important element in my mind of these regional events is not people getting on stage and giving speeches or interviews to the local media, but is that a piece of every single one of these regional events that we've done and we are continuing to do throughout the rest of this year and going forward, it closes with a live training. So I mentioned that I did a few slides on what the content of the training actually is, definitions, signs to look for. Every one of these events, so for instance, the one on your screen is from the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. After a few comments were made, we actually did a live training for 40 minutes for 250 hoteliers from the Miami area. So they are now certified on all of those things, that they've gone through the training, they know the signs to look for, they left with a certificate, they've completed their training. And so it was a real worthwhile event. And then as you can see, the headline following the Super Bowl was the kind of statistics that you like to see: 47 arrests and the rescue of 22 victims. So we felt very good about playing a small role in that in Miami. On the next slide, I just wanted to illustrate some of the partners we worked with. I've mentioned a few of them already. Department of Homeland Security, certainly the White House is doing some work on this. Some of the nonprofit groups that we've worked with, such as A21, which is ending human trafficking and sexual slavery in the 21st century. BEST is a group that provides training content to many businesses, such as state hotel and state restaurant associations around the country. We're working with all of those on these events and to continue raising awareness. On the next slide, just to give you an example of some of the other events we've done to raise awareness, and again, each of these also have a training component for local hoteliers. We did an event in Iowa. That was actually our first event last summer as a lead-in to the Iowa State Fair, which is the biggest thing other than perhaps Iowa caucuses that happens in Iowa on an annual basis. So we did a great event with their governor and one of their U.S. senators to bring attention to what the industry is doing to stop it. And we had similar events that we did in Georgia, Texas, and Utah. We have a few more. Let me actually, on the next slide, let me first mention on the next slide, one of the things that we've done, this just, I guess, illustrates some of the quotes that have come out of these events. The one in the upper left-hand corner was in Chicago in, I believe that was late January, early February. Was an event we did with the governor there. Certainly a big hotel state, a big hotel city, and so we had a great reception. And the governor is doing great work. And in that event, I think we trained over 500 hoteliers that day on how to identify situations of human trafficking and what to do when you see those situations. So a very successful program. On the next slide, just a little more about the impact of this and changing the conversation and making sure that that the general public and the media know what our industry is doing to solve this problem. large events like we talked about in Chicago and in Miami Beach, but also smaller events where we've had roundtables or spoken with law enforcement in West Virginia on a panel discussion there. Every little bit of this helps as we continue to train hotel associates for what to look out for, and then also to change the narrative from on elected officials. Most of these events on this slide actually were around Human Trafficking Awareness Month in January. We packed a lot into that month to really show the importance of that month. We'll be doing some other things later this year around the United Nations International Day of Awareness. On the next slide, I have a few examples of where we have events on the calendar. Michigan, and I should say we had them on the calendar. We were looking to do something, as I mentioned, we've tried to plan these events in the lead in to big events that attract big crowds and unfortunately bring spikes in human trafficking. We were planning an event in the lead up to the Detroit Auto Show in Detroit, an event in Las Vegas in the lead up to the NFL draft in April, and an event at the Terranea Resort in California. However, due to current circumstances, all of those events have currently been put on hold until we have a clearer idea of when the travel industry will get moving again. But I think to close, the training every single worker is really our key message. That's the overarching goal of this campaign. However, we have to do it, as I mentioned, asking government for a mandate where none exists. If that's what it takes to root out the bad actors in our industry, we'll do it. And so we are working with states around the country. AHLA created a model piece of legislation that implements all of these elements of what we think has to be done to solve the problem and the role of state governments in that. And we are working with state hotel associations around the country to try to get that passed into law this year and next year. I think I will stop there and answer any questions about elements of the campaign that I covered, or perhaps other questions you might have for me. So again, thank you, Cornell, for inviting AHLA to take part in this conference.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. I had a question about something that you had mentioned towards the middle of your presentation. You had said that the AHLA was going to be lobbying the government to try to mandate that the industry train its employees about how to spot and prevent trafficking situations. And so my question was just kind of towards like understanding which, if any, hotels are having difficulties with not wanting to implement those trainings, and why, like some of the specific reasons why they are kind of having to be forced to do those trainings and not voluntarily taking on trainings.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that question. That's a great question. I think I guess what I would say is that I can't speak for the ones that aren't doing it, but clearly there are hotels in this country that are not doing enough, or else we wouldn't still have the situations happening. I think the vast, if not overwhelming majority of members of AHLA are doing the right thing, are training. Frequencies vary, whether it's a brand standard, that may vary. But by taking the extraordinary step of actually asking a state to mandate it, that ensures that there are no outliers. If it's, I'm not going to name any brands or specific properties, but typically, if you're part of a brand, in our work with the bigger brands, which I should say our association represents 27,000 properties across the country, which is more than half of all the hotels in the United States. And so, we have the vast majority of the larger brands, but also smaller brands and independents and the REITs and the management companies, as well as the independent resorts. So I can't speak for why some may not do it, but I think that We just have to make sure that it becomes, that we can safely say, the association and the industry can say that every single associate, every single employee in the United States should be trained, whether that is through a voluntary program through their property, or as a brand standard from their brand, or by government mandate. I guess that's just how we look at it. Thank you for the question.